Okay, there is an easy explanation of our current strategy for defending Australia against any Chinese attack. We are telling the men and women of our armed forces to go out and die, and in the process take as many Chinese with them as possible, as if Xi cares. Meanwhile, the overwhelming majority of Australians who have no family or friends in uniform will treat it as some macabre kind of football game, and not necessarily will we all be barracking for the same side. They will cheer when their side has a victory and boo when it loses a ship or plane. Then, when it is all over, the cheer squad will collectively shrug their shoulders and say, "We did our best." I'm ending this section at the Australian Army Memorial on Anzac Parade in Canberra. I'm doing so for several reasons, not least because of its powerful imagery. It covers all parts of the globe in which Australians have fought, and that includes Vietnam. Although the RAAF and the Royal Australian Navy have, at times, suffered extraordinary losses as a percentage of their force, it has always been the Army who has done the heavy lifting, simply because it is the only branch that can survive attritional warfare. Then, in Vietnam, we sent our soldiers into that war for a strategy that most Australians didn't really understand, in a country that few would have been able to find on a map, to fight a series of battles that seemed to have no purpose. To sustain our force in Vietnam, to replace those killed or wounded in those battles, we needed men, and to keep up the numbers we turned to conscripts, and Australian society fractured. What Vietnam proves, once again, is that all war is attritional. Even before Australian and American conscripts were sent there, the French had already proved it. There has not been one single war involving Australia that has not been attritional. Certainly, there can be brilliant commanders, outstanding units, crews and pilots, even lucky or unlucky ships. Yet, overwhelmingly, victory goes to the last man standing. You can either do a French Foreign Legion, reveling in the imagery of a glorious defeat in which a small group of heroes faces impossible odds with the last man standing holding the blood-covered flag to his chest, or you can try to plan for victory. In Australia, by embracing a strategy of denial, we ignore two factors. Firstly, the smaller force, when defeated, suffers a much higher percentage of its strength as losses than the larger force. Secondly, and this is a very important point, when an attacker is applying mass, then there is a tipping point against a force using a strategy of denial. When the tipping point is reached, the result is a complete and almost immediate collapse. Historical examples start with the Peloponnesian War, Napoleon in 1814, France 1940 post-Dunkirk, and of course the oft-quoted Battle of the Atlantic, for which the details are here. Which brings me to the second truism of war. With very, very few exceptions, wars are ended by negotiation. We obviously can't defeat China, but we can try and force them to the negotiating table with the purpose of getting the best possible outcome for all of us. Which is why, as a nation, we cannot accept a strategy based on denial. Once defeated, the ADF will simply cease to exist, which means it will have no relevance to any negotiations for ending the war. The alternative proposal that I present here is just one example. There are others to consider if they are given a chance to be heard. I honestly don't care if you reject mine. You just need to hear the alternatives and make up your minds for yourselves. Despite my best efforts, this is my longest presentation. Unfortunately, many of the concepts I present are quite complex, and I simply haven't the opportunity to explain them in full. This is also my last presentation in my series on defending Australia. Please go to town in the comments. Please talk about these issues with your friends and family. It is very important. As usual, I'm starting with the end point. When you look at this slide, you're probably thinking, impossible. And honestly, there's going to be a lot of shocks for many of you as we journey to the end of this presentation. Once again, I'm going to state a bias. This presentation is made on the assumption of the decline of America as a great power. Historically, this happened surprisingly quickly, and everybody who believed in or relied on that great power, refused to see its decline. In so many ways, America now reminds me of Brazil, with its enormous swings of domestic and foreign policy. However, instead of Brazil's unrealised promise, it is one of a decaying dream. How to manage that decline is an important part of my book and also that of Hugh White's. However, equally, I noted in my book that America is our ally both by choice and by mutual beliefs. It is important that, as its ally, we develop a means to provide military aid in a crisis. At the moment, this is beyond the abilities of the ADF as structured. This presentation can be no more than a snapshot. It will have an emphasis on our strategic culture, but will lack any look at China's. I will also not discuss several important aspects that include a civil defence agency, a paramilitary merchant marine. Note, these two would mean the end of MACA, which is the only use we have for the Canberra-class ships, Royal Australian Navy Marines, a strategic strike capability, a reserve air force, the transformation of the reserves into local defence forces, a functioning space force completely independent of the RAAF, defining the Australian Border Force. Is it a Coast Guard or is it not? And of course a strategic strike capability. How, purpose, avoiding immediacy, which is something rarely discussed, and in what form. Thank you for bearing with me and getting this far in my series of presentations. I explained at the beginning of this series that you could not develop a defence policy without understanding all the issues that need to be managed. So in this series I have discussed geographic scale, the limitations of equipment built for a European battlefield, the impact of the Defence Strategic Review on the Army, understanding the problems with procurement, asking why and how China is a threat, our sleepwalking into a major change in strategic planning, and of course the devil in the mix, the Australian Defence Department. I would note that luckily, the one thing that will never be of concern is the men and women of the ADF, though honestly, there is now a big question mark over their leadership. Well, I am hoping to surprise many of you throughout this presentation. Let's start off with the number of services in the ADF that I recommend. I will only be discussing 4 of the possible 9 arms or branches recommended in my book. The ones discussed here are the Reserve Army, as opposed to the Army Reserves, the Professional Army, the RAAF, and the Royal Australian Navy. Before I commence, I would like to make 2 important points. Attritional warfare is not just about soldiers, although obtaining the numbers needed is the focus of this discussion on the Reserve Army. Attritional warfare is also about having the range of munitions we need, which in the 21st century are expended at incredible rates. This means we need the logistic chain and manufacturing capacity to produce the numbers needed and when they are needed. What they are and how they are used, even where they are used, is a major part of the discussion on the professional army that follows on from this section. Brutally, a strategy of attrition requires warm bodies. A major problem in developing an Australian Reserve Army is that they are usually based on conscription. One example is the West German Reserve Army, based entirely on conscription, that it eventually became so large that it became the dominant force in NATO prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the 1980s, Germany could triple the size of its conscript army by calling up its trained reserves, and it could field nearly 1.5 million men, all fully equipped. However, it is not enough to simply throw a uniform on a bunch of volunteers or conscripts. They need basic training, then specialist training, and then unit training within steadily larger formations. The German reserves needed about a year for this level of training, and of course, they needed the equipment and a supply chain strong enough to keep them supplied in the field. Also, a reserve army cannot be created at the flip of a switch. It took the Germans nearly 25 years. Certainly, Australia can start to create one almost immediately, but it will take roughly 12 years before it reaches the recommended strength in this presentation. Still, each year it will be significantly stronger than the year before, so the sooner we start, the better. Okay, I'm going to be a little blunt, and this may shock quite a few, but conscription is simply not available to Australia post the Vietnam Schism. The political divide means no form of compulsory military training is possible. Simply forget it. Perhaps, as the strategic situation deteriorates, it may become acceptable, but trying to do so at present will kill the creation of a reserve army. This means volunteer enlistments. How we get those volunteers, the military training pathway and career development is covered later in this presentation. However, there are always difficulties with a reserve army. It requires a new legal framework, preferably with constitutional amendments, and it needs to overcome opposition from both the Professional Officer Corps and the Defence Department. Both hate the idea of a mass army, messy things with too many amateurs who bring their own ideas, demands, and ways to get things done. Again, the concept I am recommending is nuanced, but I'll try and keep it brief. Once the volunteers have completed their year's training, any further involvement is simply not compulsory. This is extremely important. However, there has to be a pathway to senior roles both as NCOs and officers, still without a formal term of enlistment. This is also quite important. Do the year and there is no further commitment, even in a reserve unit. However, Australia now has a trained soldier subject to compulsory service in a crisis. Each year's intake must produce a self-contained formation. In other words, it needs its own MPs, medical staff, combat engineers, etc. This is one reason why I recommended a much larger intake in my book. There must also be recruitment pathways for relevant tertiary and vocational education and career pathways outside of the military. The only compulsion is that, when they sign up, the members of the Reserve Army are subject to compulsory call-up for service within continental Australia, including Tasmania and the territorial waters of those two land masses only, and that would occur in the event of a military threat to Australia. Okay, the big one, numbers. I'm going to go lower than in the book, as I said, largely because we haven't had the public debate that we need. Instead, I'm going to look at raising a brigade equivalent, including supporting arms, each year. That's from 3,000 to 5,000 recruits a year on a 12-year cycle. This will give Australia the potential of up to 4 mechanised divisions 5 to 10 years before we will see an AUKUS submarine. Here is, if you like, another wrinkle. Under this concept, units of our current professional army cannot be deployed overseas, as it has done so many times in the last 50 years. Rather, only members of the Reserve Army can serve overseas, but even then only on a volunteer basis. This restriction does not apply to the Royal Australian Navy. Some of you may recognise in this an important element of our strategic culture. This is a simplification, but almost all the volunteers of the 1st and 2nd AOF had some form of military training or experience. The conscripts, by law, could not serve outside of Australia or its territories. This meant that we had to have volunteers for overseas service. There was no compulsion for conscripts to serve overseas until the laws were changed by Curtin in 1944. This makes for some interesting political and military outcomes. The government can no longer commit Australia to an unpopular war. The number of volunteers willing to serve would quickly dry up. Defining the terms of overseas volunteer service would have to be made at the beginning. Traditionally, it is for the duration or a maximum of 4 years. This has many positive outcomes that I can't cover here. Members of the professional army can only sign up for overseas service on an as-needs basis, and then with the aim of training up volunteers to take over their role. Restricting overseas deployment to volunteers from the Reserve Army, even as UN peacekeepers, provides experience for some, but hopefully not too many. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this next point. Although possible, it is highly unlikely that the Chinese could, without warning, launch a surprise attack with enough force that the Reserve Army's Ready Brigade could not handle. The RAAF and RAN are a different matter, and all three are discussed later. It is important that, in a developing crisis, the government not delay in calling up the Reserve Army. It is better to have them prepare and be stood down at the end of a crisis than rush them into the field. Once mobilised, they'd pose an immediate deterrent to attack, plus be better trained and able to field more brigades the more time they have to prepare. There are some hurdles. As I've noted, the first is the defence establishment. The major long-term hurdle is the equipment. Another hurdle is training. Then there is organisation. But most importantly, there is a question, why should they enlist? I'll include this last one in a general discussion on the need for a debate at the end of this presentation. Australia is about to build the Redbacks and is currently building the Boxers and Hawkeyes. Even without fixing overspends, the reality is that we could double the annual production of Redbacks and continue the production of Boxers, Hawkeyes and Huntsman self-propelled artillery. Even if we don't get costs under control, we can create a fully equipped brigade for the Reserve Army for around $7 to $8 billion a year. Can we afford it? I'd refer you to the previous presentations on the Defence Department for possible savings and the other presentation on the problems with procurement. Specialist heavy equipment, such as main battle tanks, missile batteries, air defence and drones, are more difficult, and without reforms, there will be problems with quality and cost. The following page displays a spreadsheet with the costings for the creation of a fully equipped brigade. You may wish to pause the presentation to have a good look. This spreadsheet remains an overview. There is a lot left out, such as air defence, but in comparison to the overall cost of the brigade, their costs are relatively low. Equally, that will be offset by a reduction in the size and cost of the regular army that we'll be discussing later, and we need to get the ongoing expenses down to at least the level of other Western militaries. Almost all the training and maintenance costs will come from the sustainment budget, and equipment costs should come down over time as production increases and becomes a constant yearly amount. However, based on today's figures, you're looking at $8 billion per year to create and maintain a reserve army with a potential strength of 4 mechanised divisions. I would note that almost all of its equipment is made in Australia except for the main battle tanks. We probably only need enough main battle tanks for 4 brigades, as we are unlikely to dispatch a larger force overseas. This would result in a saving of $1 billion Australian dollars for each of the last brigades. Final point, the HIMARS belong to the Reserve Army, and they make up the divisional and corps level artillery assets. There is an important aspect to the equipment for reserve armies that is often not discussed. The AFVs and heavy equipment are in 3 stages of maintenance, each one costing less than the other. The first stage is operationally ready. In this instance, it would be the equivalent of 1 brigade's worth of equipment during the volunteer training period. The second stage is in reserve, essentially unused but ready for immediate deployment. This would be the amount needed to equip 2 additional brigades. Then you're looking at mothballing equipment. Absolute minimum maintenance is required. They can't be brought back into the field without a major overhaul. This stage would max out at an additional 9 brigade equivalents, but is, as I've shown here, relatively inexpensive. Now we'll look at training. South East Australia will remain the primary training areas as it has done so historically. Additional infrastructure will be needed depending on the numbers. Locating it here also makes sense, as this is virtually the centre of Australia's demographic heart. The main problem here is that, obviously, the main provider of the training will be the professional army. It is an extremely difficult role to get right, especially if there is a reluctance on their part in taking on this duty. Okay, let's look at basic organisation. Recruitment and the brigades themselves should be state-based, preferably even regional. The experience of the first and second AIFs show that there are massive advantages in recruitment, retention and unit cohesion. Equally, after any conflict, repatriation, return to civilian society and post-conflict support was significantly better amongst volunteers from state or regional based units compared to those involved in later wars. A reserve army should reflect all these factors and focus on Australia's geographic heartland, which is how we get to this basic structure, but now we need to look at mobilisation. Before I start on mobilisation, and without reopening the whole debate about gutting the army, it was obvious that I was unable to convey my point. It was not that the pre-DSR army could only deploy one mechanised brigade, which I repeatedly acknowledged. Rather, it was that under Plan Bathsheba, the army had the capacity to field a mechanised infantry division with 3 brigades in an emergency once former soldiers were recalled as per their terms of enlistment, and to that you would add volunteers. This pool created the manpower and needed to flesh out the other 2 brigades, which were fully equipped, although back then it was with obsolete equipment. There were obvious problems with this mobilisation, not least with training. Unfortunately, this ability is now lost to the professional army, which is another reason why we need a reserve army. It's not that the old ADF had 3 deployable mechanised brigades, it is that it had the potential to field 3 mechanised brigades. Now we're going to look at the recruits now. Cruelly, the best age range for fighting a war is from 18 to 30. The primary source of these recruits for the reserve army will be 18 and over, although you can obviously volunteer if you're much older and past the entry requirements. However, this rather neatly provides a pattern not dissimilar to Plan Bathsheba. More importantly, it also provides 2 distinct but simultaneous mobilisation pathways in the event of a crisis. You can see that an important criteria is time. It takes time to create a reserve army. It would take 12 years for the reserve army to max out under this proposal. If we started creating the reserve army in 2026, it will reach its maximum strength in 2038. Obviously, as the strategic situation changes, the numbers can increase or decrease in response. However, we may need an expanded ADF well before 2038. Only Reserve Army gives Australia a steadily increasing combat strength for the ADF in the event of a crisis. As discussed in the presentation on China, a crisis for which Australia needs to mobilise a Reserve Army is dependent upon 3 things. They are the fall of Taiwan, the Chinese perception of America's willingness to take part in the Greater Pacific War, and Xi's advancing age. The interaction of all 3 factors gives a very volatile timeline. The timescale for an escalating crisis is a 3 to 7 year time frame based around the fall of Taiwan, even if that is through negotiation. If we started forming a reserve army at the beginning of 2026, that would give us a real or potential force of between 2 to 6 brigades in the crisis years, with a training and manufacturing capacity large enough to keep them in the field. After this period, the decline of America will create an unknown period of strategic uncertainty. If this happens, we will have developed the potential for 4 mechanised divisions by 2038. Now I will provide an overview of the mobilisation of the Reserve Army. The first pathway is straight out mobilisation by units. At the end of the first year, you have a mechanised infantry brigade. It is unlikely to be the It is unlikely to be the equal of the ADF's current 3rd Brigade, but it wouldn't be too far off. More importantly, it exists. Although the volunteers moved back into civilian life at the end of that year, they remained ready for immediate call-up. There is a crossover towards the end of the year where the brigade in training becomes a ready brigade. Obviously, during the first few years constructing the Reserve Army, officers and senior NCOs are drawn from the professional army, reducing as suitable candidates are trained and fast-tracked from the volunteers. Please note that I am leaving out entire sections on developing senior officers, also staff training, maintaining group cohesion, etc. Once you have your 1st Brigade, this is where the rule of 3 starts to come in. At the end of year 2, Australia now has the equipment for 2 brigades, but only 1 ready to go. The other moves into reserve. The first year's recruit need limited retraining. Reserve armies, such as Israel's, require about 5 weeks training a year to maintain their effectiveness, but in a crisis have been on the front line within a week. Once again, this is a little bit more complicated than I've said here. It is not unreasonable to believe that reforming the 1st Brigade will happen within a week, faster in a crisis, there is going to be a shortfall in numbers largely due to desertion and for medical reasons. Please note that when you look at these, at the numbering for these brigades, they are in reverse order. 1st Brigade will always be the oldest, while the highest number brigade will always be the most recently trained. By year 3, towards the end of the training year, we once again have a brigade, the 3rd, ready to go, but we now have 2 brigades in reserve capable of quick deployment. Ideally, 1st Brigade would have 4 to 6 weeks for mobilisation and retraining. Again, there is now going to be an even greater shortfall in numbers for the older brigade. It took a year under Plan Bathsheba for a brigade to be prepared for deployment under peacetime conditions. In 1973, Israel had ad hoc reserve units on the front line within 48 hours. So it's a case of how immediate is the crisis. In other words, the Reserve Army will allow Australia to field a fully equipped mechanised division within 6 weeks, faster in a crisis. Now we are looking at the longer cycles. At year 4, it's been 3 years since our first group of volunteers has had military training. From now on, every additional year creates a greater need for retraining. At the end of the 12 years and the completion of the Reserve Army, the retraining program would look like this. So again, in reverse order, for the 3rd cycle, the ideal training period would be 1 to 3 months, and 3 to 6 months for the 2nd and 1st cycles. In a crisis, this timescale can obviously be reduced at the cost of higher casualties. Again, as each group ages, the shortfall in numbers will increase. Note that the mass of the Reserve Army will allow the time needed to train crisis volunteers, or as they were known to the first AIF, the true believers. They need that time to reach the level they need, and then they form the replacement pool for the Reserve Army. Which brings us to the second mobilisation pathway. It would be nice for us to have the time to put a 2 or even a 3 or 4 division Reserve Army into the field. China would need an enormous attacking force, backed by a serious logistics train and replacement pipeline, as well as a lengthy campaign to overcome such a force. The reality is that we are unlikely to get anywhere near that much time to form 4 divisions. So we are looking at a replacement pipeline to maintain 1 or 2 mechanised divisions in the field. It is important to emphasise there is no such pipeline for our professional army, now or in the future. This is an example of what I mean by a replacement pipeline. In a crisis, Australia immediately fields a mechanised division within 4 weeks, 48 hours if the situation is dire. The soldiers and equipment from cycles 2 and 3 then become the replacement source to keep the combat brigades in the field. Cycle 4 is available as needed. This order provides time for additional training for the later cycles. Depending on the levels of attrition and pace of recruitment and equipment production, it may be possible to form other brigades. Logically, they will come from later brigades due to their longer training times. True believers, after training, can flesh out the older cycles. Note that in equipment terms, and ignoring any accelerated production, the equipment pipeline provides a reserve of 2 vehicles for every one in the division in the field. This is also what I mean when I say both forms of mobilisation are simultaneous. There are numerous and achievable variations to the mobilisation of a Reserve Army. I've mentioned the German Reserve Army before, and if you get a chance to read up on its development, it's actually quite interesting. In its final form in the 80s, just before the end of the Cold War, its reserve brigades developed the ability to create a ghost battalion. Essentially, applying it here, each Cycle 1 brigade would include enough NCOs and officers to form a 4th battalion fleshed out by soldiers and equipment from Cycle 2. Alternatively, you could create a mechanised infantry corps of 2 weak divisions based around 2 brigades plus the tanks, self-propelled artillery and supporting equipment stripped from Cycle 2 that is needed to bring these 2 divisions up to strength. This is why the first 4 brigades need to have main battle tanks. Financially, the Reserve Army is remarkably cost-effective. If you think about it, the Reserve Army's wages bill never really exceeds the cost of that initial brigade, even allowing for ongoing officer and NCO training. Once their year's service is over, they stop getting paid. Even when the pool of reservists reaches its maximum, the cost doesn't go up. Again, please note that I'm ignoring the cost of recruitment or options for further training or retraining, tertiary and vocational education pathways, but in comparison to the cost of creating brigade, these costs are nominal. The aim here is to have a reserve army which can take serious punishment and still remain in the field. Simply because of geography and demographics, almost all the major units in the Reserve Army will be in the southern half of Australia, below a line drawn from Perth to Brisbane. But this is far from being a replay of the infamous Brisbane line. To avoid it, the obvious problem is giving them the time they need to deploy. Just as importantly, we need a means to make life as difficult as possible for any attacking Chinese force. And that's where the professional army comes in. Time for another shock. The professional army is going to have a structure that looks a lot like the DSR, which I have torn to shreds. But it's, again, a bit more nuanced than that simple comparison. Australia's professional army will now have a major training role, but for almost all of its history, it has either been a coastal defence force or is equipped as one. Early on, it just started as coastal forts protecting the major cities. It's only with Vietnam that the professional army has become an expeditionary force. My recommendations are taking it back to its roots. Rather than forts, modern coastal defences are zonal. The recommended structure of the professional army gives us 4 zones plus a training command in the southeast. This training command plus a reserve army is a significant military force in its own right. Again, due to time, I'm not going to go into this further. Each of the coastal zones or the fortress zones do not have to have identical equipment. Rather, it is the equipment that is best suited for the terrain. Bear with me on this. It's quite a complicated concept overall. I'm obviously not talking about the coastal artillery that protected cities along Australia's east coast. Instead, consider the professional army as a coastal defence force in a modern setting, defending fortified zones with a mobile strike capability. The range and lethality of available weapons could give them a reach of up to 1,500 kilometres, possibly further. Still, as I noted in my presentation on geographic scale, this is probably the minimum needed for a continental defence. Still, in order to make this structure viable, there are several factors to look at. Location, weaponry, including cost and technology, industrial support, and logistics chain. Before I kick on, I would note that modern coastal defences also include missile-armed fast attack craft, maritime surface and subsurface drones, and mines, all under the command of the professional army, though with exceptions. Due to time, I'm leaving that discussion out of this presentation. There are always 3 components that a fortress needs. Defence, of course, but it also needs a means of offence, and it's all too often forgotten, a need for reinforcement. Go back 1,500 years, and an integral part of the role of the fortress was raiding parties that went out, destroying food, shelter, and small enemy parties. However, there was an attritional cost to each raid, so it needed reinforcements to retain its raiding capacity. Without reinforcements, the fortress just became a big wall. If a fortress is strong in all 3 components, then an enemy is left with 4 choices. Siege, which is time-consuming and costly. Assault, less time but greater casualties. Containment, leaving enough forces to attrit the fortress's raiding capacity while suffering attrition yourself. Or finally, you can ignore it, which usually meant you were facing defeat. I'm going to talk about reinforcement last, but in a modern context, it is probably the most important. Let's look at offence, and please prepare for another shock. The general perception is that with modern missiles, you fire a missile, you sink a ship. In a recent analysis of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the Americans assumed an interception rate of 70% for any anti-ship missile, though some analysts put it as high as in a minimum of 90%. In other words, the majority of missiles are not going to get through. In fact, what we are seeing from the ongoing engagement in the Red Sea is that a task force that has enough ships and types of ships can create a layered defence that is extremely difficult for missiles to penetrate. What we know from the Black Sea is that having too few ships or types of ships leads to catastrophe. I know that there is a lot more to this statement and these comparisons, but again, brevity. Equally, if you think about it, there are three ways to overcome the layered defence of a naval task force. One is to swamp it with the state-of-the-art missiles. The second is to swamp it with a mix of the state-of-the-art plus former basic missiles. The third is to attrit its defences using either or both of these options. The problem with swamping a naval task force, either with state-of-the-art missiles launched from ship or land, or else a mix of missiles, is actually getting enough missiles in the first place, then getting them where they are needed, remember in Australia Geographic scale, and then actually finding the task force to attack it. The HIMARS simply lack the range, and we will be lucky to see the anti-ship variant of the Tomahawk in any great numbers within a decade. However, we can produce simpler and cheaper missiles, each with that 1500 kilometre range, and in fact possibly longer. Oddly enough, in my book I discussed the Iranian Shahed 136, seen here being launched. I noted that, in addition to its range, an Australian variant can be produced quickly, be modified to be a loitering drone, or an anti-personnel and reconnaissance variant. All these are being seen in the Russian version of this drone. In enough numbers, even simple missiles will overwhelm a defence and cause catastrophic losses. However, the problem is, once more, not only getting enough missiles, but getting them where they are needed, and then having the capacity to launch them. This is almost impossible without organisation and pre-planning. An interesting example is Hezbollah's missile offensive against Israel. It entered into the conflict with upwards of an estimated 100,000 missiles of mixed quality. It launched an average of about 30 a day for nearly a year, or about 10,000. Even when an Israeli ground invasion became obvious, they were not able to noticeably increase the numbers launched. Without the ability to use those extra 90,000 missiles, they may as well have been sandbags. This is the problem that must be addressed. However, before we get there, we have to look at how we can attrit the defensive weaponry of any naval task force. Sticking with the same example of Hezbollah, it may well be, and we probably won't know for some years, that a major factor in Israel deciding to launch a ground invasion of Lebanon was that Hezbollah's missile campaign, combined with a few major attacks from Iran, was reducing Israel's missile defense munitions to dangerous levels. We also know that the US Navy was remarkably successful at using SM-2s to shoot down Houthi missiles in the Red Sea. There is sometimes a disparaging comparison between using an Australian $3 million missile to shoot down one that cost $40,000, but the Yanks have also shot down ballistic missiles. It's not the cost that matters, it's the complexity. It takes far longer to produce an SM-2, so if you keep up the attacks, then, once again, you can reduce any missile munitions to dangerous levels. Already, the Americans are concerned over the rate of expenditure in the Red Sea and its impact on ammunition stocks. There is also the logistics question. You have to either have bases nearby to restock your munitions, or you need the ability to restock at sea. The Americans are under pressure to maintain their force in the Red Sea due to ammunition expenditure. They're experimenting with that sea restocking simply because a ship going back to a port is a ship out of action. However, restocking ammunition at sea opens up a whole raft of different risks. This brings up an interesting tactical concept that flies in the face of our current strategy. It's time for another shock. It is actually far easier and much cheaper to force the Chinese to use up their air defence munitions of a naval task force than it is to sink its ships, such as this Chinese Type 22 destroyer. Think of the fortified zone's offence as being more like the raiders of those old medieval castles. Even though there is 1,000 years between them, the aim is not to destroy the main enemy force, but to steadily wear down their ability to stay in the field. This Chinese destroyer, has an impressive amount of missiles, though, as in the US Navy, the number of VLSLs is misleading. Before sailing, the ship has a loadout of different types of missiles that include anti-air, ground strike, and anti-ship. However, I'll make the unlikely assumption that they all contain anti-air missiles. This gives the ship a total of 88 anti-air missiles. After that, they are relying on its close-in weapon system. At this point, it would be suicidal for the ship to stay in combat. Therefore, once the Chinese munitions drop to a dangerous level, they must withdraw. Again, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but hopefully you are getting the idea. It's attrition by material, not by bodies. Before I proceed to the last, absolutely crucial concept of reinforcement, I'll delve a little into the types of missiles. Let me start off with a simple fact that is often overlooked. There are no super weapons, whether they be China's hypersonic missiles or the venerable Tomahawk. Certainly, there are doomsday weapons, but not super weapons. History, even today, shows that a mix of weapons based around sound organization and operational concept is far superior to relying on a single weapon system or platform. It is also, by far, more cost-effective. Now, this is the HIMARS. Each launcher system costs $40 million. Each extra missile costs $2 million, and that's Australian. At the moment, each missile has a range of 500 kilometres. Perhaps, sometime in the future, we may have received upgraded missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometres. Honestly, in the defence of continental Australia, its current small range severely reduces their usefulness, which is why I recommend their transfer to the Reserve Army. Meanwhile, this is the Tomahawk with its anti-ship variant. It has a range of around 1,500 kilometres and is much more suitable for Australia. In this discussion, I will assume we have missiles with a greater range, though this is unlikely much before the mid-30s for reasons discussed in the presentation on procurement. This is an example, not a recommendation. Again, this is the Iranian Shahed 136 that I've discussed previously. Hopefully, even our defence industry can produce something with at least its range and versatility. The Russians use them as a cheap cruise missile, a loitering cruise missile, and a reconnaissance drone. Cost estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 Australian dollars. It has a range of around 1,500 kilometres, with the new Russian drones possibly having a range as far as 2,500 kilometres. Although it only has a warhead of about 40 kilograms, I would strongly suggest not being on a ship if it was hit by one. This is actually its launch platform. Basically, it's a small truck with a launch frame welded onto the back that can both carry and launch 5 missiles. Cost of the launcher system is about 100,000 Australian dollars. For the cost of one HIMARS launcher, you could, depending on the cost and complexity of the 136, have anywhere from 80 to around 600 of these missiles. Obviously, they are far simpler and cheaper to build, and therefore can be built in far greater numbers, which again suits the raiding tactic, but that's still not the real problem for their use, as Hezbollah has found. Firstly, we need to find an enemy task force. This is a major reason I have limited the coastal defence zones to the north, because they have the tremendous advantage of coverage by the drawn network. That still only solves part of the problem. Now you have to look at range. This is approximately the current range of the HIMARS. This is their proposed range. This is the proposed range of the Tomahawks in the anti-ship role. It is also the current range of the 136 in both an anti-ship, ground strike and other variants. This is the possible range of the enhanced Russian variant. Going back to the old raider concept, the greater the range of the fort's raiders, then the further an enemy must travel to avoid them, or the greater are your losses if they do not reduce the fortress. A range of 1,500 kilometers gives you the minimum coverage needed. Therefore, it is not the accuracy of the missile and the size of the warhead, but its range that is the most important. However, I still haven't addressed the major problem with their use. Getting there, but not yet. What is needed is an ability to launch multiple salvos. The ability to launch repeat salvos is absolutely critical. No matter what missiles we use, whether it be HIMARS, Tomahawks or 136s, it will be almost impossible to get enough launched in a single wave to overwhelm a Chinese task force with enough ships and types of ships that they have a layered defense. At this point you may be saying, what about the Air Force? And I'll come to that later. At the moment I am looking at simply wearing down the Chinese air defense from using missiles from the fortified zones. That brings us to the absolutely crucial concept. In order to do so, just like the old fortresses, we need to overcome the attrition, not of the enemy, but of our raiders. I refer to this in my book as a complicated dance. Logistically, you need three distinct links, though each must work together. There are the launchers, moved into position and able to fire an immediate salvo. There is a second wave of launchers, able to move up and launch another salvo, ideally within an hour. This puts them around 50 kilometers from any launch position. A third wave is rearming from multiple small stockpiles within the fortified zone. These three formations simply rotate through each launch sequence. 15 trucks, roughly a platoon strength force, with all three waves making roughly a company, can launch a salvo of 75 missiles per hour. This gives us the ability to launch a salvo roughly every 50 kilometers a Chinese task force sails, and importantly, these salvos are not launched from the same locations. Alternatively, you could theoretically launch over 200 missiles every 3 hours. Personally, I dislike the all of the eggs in one basket approach. There is too much that can go wrong, but the option is there. Obviously, the need for an extensive road network and munition stockpiles and launchers are critical requirements. Of course, as the ranges increase, so too do the options. However, there is always a risk with other options such as fixed launch sites. In a worst case scenario, you could do a Hezbollah and replicate its really expensive sandbags. Maneuver and disbursement remain key aspects of my recommendations within the fortified zones. The next link is the movement of ammunition from larger stockpiles in more secure areas. The third is a movement from storage and production facilities in the much safer southeast. There are a variety of methods, but even by truck you could achieve a 4-day turnaround. However, at all times, the transport should involve numerous small transport units. The second and third links are why the Army's Logistic Corps must take on a more prominent role. As in the old medieval forts, the manpower requirement for defending the coastal zones is quite small. Including the Armoured Corps, you are looking at reducing the professional Army's combat battalions by half, though with an expanded training role and an increased logistics corps. Essentially, in each fortified zone, you are looking at a reinforced battalion consisting of at least one company of launchers, with the potential for local defence volunteers to crew additional launchers, a command and control company for the missiles, half fixed, half mobile, one company of mechanised infantry, one specialist company depending on location, as an example riverine or mechanised, a combination of long, medium and short range air defence batteries, again also dependent on location. This then is the concept of the fortified zones. I have to emphasise that the Army structure that I've recommended does not lead to the reintroduction of the old Brisbane line. Far from it. There is a concept I've used in a previous presentation called the sword and the shield, but in terms of the defence of continental Australia, the shield is the professionals, the sword is the reserve army. The latter provides both mass and flexibility depending on the threat and its level of mobilisation. Still, in this discussion I have, however, left a tremendous amount out. They include the use of low-cost missiles in support of ground operations, both from zones under attack and from other zones in support. This is why I've included those ranges on the earlier maps. demolitions, including resource and civilian infrastructure, interoperability with the Royal Australian Navy, special forces, local defence volunteers, even partisans, the bureaucracy, perhaps one day even local conscription may be acceptable. Then there is of course recruitment and any incentives for people to serve in these areas. Now it's time to look at the Royal Australian Navy. I have a real problem with the Navy just from the perspective of my book. I wrote it mostly in 2022, finished it in early 2023, then waited till the DSR was finalised. I decided that I didn't need to cover the DSR as I'd already argued against Hugh White's concept of a strategy of denial, and a lot of the DSR was simply plagiarising his book. With regards to Navy, this has proved to be a pretty important mistake. The DSR was then followed by the absurd 10-month delay for the Surface Fleet Review. It has proven to be such a disaster for the Navy that all my presumptions in the book, based on then procurement options, went out the window. What follows is a modification of my earlier work based around developments for the Royal Australian Navy over the last 18 months. Let's start with the only viable strategy the Navy has since the DSR. In the initial phase of any major Chinese military move against Australia, the only role of the Navy is to survive. That's it. End of story. Going head-to-head against a Chinese task force achieves nothing. If the Chinese are superior in numbers, then we will probably lose more ships than them. The real role of the Royal Australian Navy is now as a force in being. A major risk the Chinese will have to manage, whether it be in the resources needed to protect its logistics tail, or because the Royal Australian Navy is adding punch to a salvo launched from a fortified zone once the initial Chinese naval surge is over. Yet, as long as Australia is tied into the American strategy for the Western Pacific, we have a strategic dilemma. There are two quite different roles for our Navy. If it was a more balanced force, this wouldn't be a problem. However, as I noted in previous presentation, the Royal Australian Navy's deployment means it is nowhere near a balanced force. Generally, the larger ships are in the east and the frigates are in the west, and this complicates things. Ideally, we should have a Fleet East and a Fleet West with an identical structure. Fleet West would have priority in any limited conflict with China. Fleet East would support the Americans in any Greater Pacific War. The non-active fleet provides reserve ships and crew for the priority fleet. The problem now is the rule of three. That is, one ship in each class will be having a major refit. Another will need maintenance and crew rest, while there will only be one out of every three ready for sea. We only have three of our most powerful ships, the Hobarts, and we will soon only have 6 Anzac frigates, and we'll be lucky to get this many Hunters, and even then it will be another decade before we see the first one. The situation for our submarines is even more dire, with constant media reports of there only being one ready for sea at any one time. In an emergency situation, we can surge ships, and with enough crew, get 2 out of 3 ships to sea, although this comes at postponing important maintenance. Based on these numbers, it is impossible for us to maintain a balanced fleet on both sides of Australia. Slightly misquoting General Molan, the Royal Australian Navy is now a one-shot wonder. Unfortunately, there are few short to medium-term options available. Even though we have the tooling and manufacturing processes available for the Hobarts, we've lost the skilled workforce needed. We could restart the production, but given the capabilities of the Defence Department, it would be like starting the program from scratch and probably take at least a decade to get the first ship. In fact, this is exactly what the Surface Fleet Review states, with replacement destroyers not to be commenced until the Hunters are all produced. However, the production pipeline for the Hunters is a disaster. There's no other word for it. It's not just the expense, which we could accept if it wasn't for their reduced numbers and the massive production delays. One option is the so-called second-tier frigates. They're only second-tier if we have better ships than the Navy. For nearly 10 years, any of these ships will be superior to the Hunters, simply because we won't have any, so that kind of makes them first tier. There is a crew shortage, but retiring the remaining Anzac frigates and the 2 Canberra-class ships should give us enough to crew 12 general-purpose frigates. It is planned to have our first one in service by 2030, with one built every subsequent year. The first 3 are to be built overseas, the remainder in Australia. I've put a break in there of a year, just so we can get things organised. If we kept the overseas construction going at the same time as the Australian construction, then we could achieve 9 frigates before we would get the second Hunter, and we would still have sovereign shipbuilding facilities. Yet, the reality is that the Navy is severely declining over the next decade. Without change, it creates a truly awful scenario. If you want the Royal Australian Navy to cease to exist in the opening moves of a war with China, then, in its basing and structure, we've pretty well achieved that. If you want the Navy to remain a force in being, then we need to keep it as secure as possible while the fortress zones and the reserve army absorbs the first blows. As long as the Royal Australian Navy exists, its ships, its crews, and its tradition will ensure that the Chinese will have a major threat that they cannot ignore. The reality is the only place we can successfully do so and create a single balanced fleet is in the southeast, and this is how it looks. And now for the final shock, the Royal Australian Air Force. Russian fixed-wing aircraft losses, those destroyed in combat, damaged or lost on the ground, run to slightly above 100, depending on the sources. That's around 10% of the Russian fighter and attack aircraft. Again, depending on sources, this is about equal to the new planes produced by Russia as replacements for their lost aircraft. Notably, about half were lost in the first year of the war. One reason for the lower loss rates in the later years of the war is that the Russian Air Force may have to face NATO's Air Force, so it is unwilling to accept an attrition rate higher than its replacement rate. In theory, the disparity in numbers are such that the Russians could just overwhelm the Ukrainians. In reality, Ukrainians' air defences, not just the fighters, would severely attrit the Russian Air Force and weaken it against NATO. Modern air forces have become so expensive and so difficult to replace that there is a reluctance to risk losses. It is an interesting effect. In my book, I called this as the Air Force training and preparing for what-if scenarios, while the soldiers and the sailors do the dying. The current role of the Air Force is to deploy forward. However, we simply do not know what the attrition rate would be against a Chinese naval task force. How long will it take for the RAAF to cease to exist? Or, if you like, the forward movement is based on the principle of give me victory or give me death. Unfortunately, there is a tremendous and growing advantage the Chinese have that would indicate the most likely outcome of any forward movement would be death. This is the satellite reconnaissance assets deployed by China for just 2 military exercises involving Australia. They were Exercise Talisman Sabre, as well as the Exercise Malabar naval drills held off Sydney. The resources available to the Chinese are extraordinary and leave our Dawn system for dead. Meanwhile, Australia's own Space Force was not created as a separate agency, but rather as a junior branch of a cash-strapped Air Force. Its creation is best described as stillborn. This is an example of the satellite imagery the Chinese Space Agency released just to let the world know their capabilities. There are weaknesses to satellite reconnaissance, as for all types of reconnaissance, but the reality is that they have a tremendous advantage. They will know when the RAAF is preparing to deploy north, they will know when they actually deploy north, and they will know what forces have been deployed and where. In deploying forward, we are creating the perfect storm for the Air Force. So what do I mean by a perfect storm? The first picture here is of an airbase hit by American Tomahawks. The following is an assessment of the results of a major war game over the defense of Taiwan by the American Air Force. It's worth pausing to read it. I'll also put the link in the comments. It forecasts losses of over 20% of total American air power in a worst-case scenario, and this is with the Americans having their own advanced reconnaissance and killer satellites. Entire squadrons, almost all the starting force, will be wiped out. While it is fair to state that I'm using an incredibly intense combat scenario as an example of what the Air Force can expect, the reality is that in any limited war against Australia, the Chinese would have a tremendous advantage. As I said, they would know where and when to hit to cause the most damage. They could use a variety of methods, from the traditional to sub-launch surface-to-surface missiles. This means, in order to avoid such a result, the only conceivable role for the RAAF is the protection of the crucial infrastructure in the southeast. That is, the training facilities of the Reserve Army, the manufacturing facilities for the ADF's equipment and ammunitions, the Navy's logistic facilities and shipyards, and of course, the bulk of Australia's population. Air defences for cities and major towns outside of this zone is handled by the local defence volunteers, while each fortress zone has its own air defence. The Air Force adopting a defensive role for the southeast creates some interesting results. Firstly, the bear bases are no longer needed. In fact, they pose such a strategic risk that they should probably be demolished. Tyndall, if they want it, should become a purely American airbase, as has happened in other allied countries. Although, as I noted at the start, there are considerable components missing from this discussion, such as a civil defence agency, this then is a structure I recommend for the defence of Australia. It is designed around the most fundamental aspect of war, either now or for the Romans, or for medieval Europe, or for throughout Chinese history, and even for the first 75 years of our nation. That is, attrition. That doesn't mean you ignore the weapons and tactics of denial. After all, they are integral to the concept of a fortified zone. However, they just should not be your entire strategy. One of the more interesting aspects is the actual cost of a strategy of attrition. This is an estimate for its costing without changing the procurement of either the Virginia or AUKUS class submarines. Again, if you like, pause and have a read. If we need the OPVs, then they should be funded by Border Force. We neither need as many Hercules, based on the recommended changes, nor would we need them to have so many extra capabilities. Like most international purchases, we should be able to still get 10 Hercules for around $2.5 billion. There is simply no other way to look at the Hunters except as a failed procurement. We need to start again and get the process, and therefore the price, correct. We can then build upon the expertise that we developed while building the GP frigates. It also means the Navy would have a dozen GP frigates in a decade instead of 2 Hunters and whatever Anzac frigates are still afloat. Yet, my recommendations are still unfinished. I'm going to wrap up what's been discussed so far, but I will then finish with the absolute critical and missing aspect for the defence of Australia. Right, thank you for staying with me, not far to go now. I'll quickly summarise the benefits of the recommendations that I have made. They combine the current strategy of denial, which is currently the professional army, with a strategy of attrition, which is both the professional and the reserve army. Rather than a thin crust, it provides a defence in depth that makes use of Australia's geographic advantages. There is, at best, a moderate increase in defence spending, despite a major increase in the ADF's combat strength. I believe that, with suitable reforms, it's actually possible to achieve overall savings. It changes the nature of the alliance. Rather than integration, we retain an independent ADF which, to a degree, returns to Australia the decision about when and why we should go to war. Volunteers from the Reserve Army provides Australia with the ability to participate in operations with our allies or as peacemakers with the United Nations. There is a need for an intrinsic but weak marine unit that enables short-term interventions by the Royal Australian Navy. Due to time, I haven't been able to discuss that. It creates a realistic role for the RAAF. It retains the option of the AUKUS program, as well as the purchase of the Virginia-class submarines. However, no matter who proposes an alternate strategy, none can address the deep cultural failings and the inability to achieve results of the Australian Defence Department. It requires an immediate solution, but it is a major reform that the department cannot achieve from within. Now for the final critical issue missing so far from this presentation. It is something that the DSR almost completely ignores, as largely does Hugh White. It is something that the Defence Department includes in motherhood statements, but does nothing else. It is something that almost all our politicians ignore. To all those who try, and try very hard, you know what I mean. There is no debate about why young Australians should risk their lives in defence of their fellow countrymen. Honestly, I believe it is the single most important factor in the defence of Australia. This is the view from the Princess's Terrace at Australian Parliament House. There is a tremendous weight of history behind this view. In fact, there's been a lot of analysis on why so many Australians volunteered for overseas service in our wars and why so many have their names listed on the Rolls of Honour at the Australian War Memorial at the base of that hill. Instead of going into detail, I'm only going to look at two groups. In 1915, Australia saw a surge in volunteers, so many, in fact, that the first AIF expanded from 1 division to 5. What is surprising about this group is that they volunteered after the casualty lists from Gallipoli. To the original men of the AIF, they were known as the True Believers. The second group is those who volunteered in the early months of the Second World War. When they enlisted, they had all seen the frightful cost of the Great War. Around them, they saw the maimed, the orphans, and the widows. The question is, why did they volunteer? This is why we need a debate about defending Australia, especially if we're using a volunteer model, as does both Hugh White and myself. There are no true believers if they have no faith in what they are fighting for. In my book, I note that many of my recommendations, such as a civil defence agency, are also about forcing a debate. I made the rather trite observation that nothing focuses you on the risk of war with China than having a bomb shelter built at the end of your street. A debate needs to be more than about tanks, planes or ships. We are asking a generation to risk their lives, and we need to explain why, and it is up to them to decide if our way of life is worth the risk. We need to ask those who may volunteer why liberal democracy, despite all its faults, is the best political system of all that has been tried. Is an ideal and our way of life defending? We have to ask, how does it compare with China under the Chinese Communist Party? Are there policies of the Chinese Communist Party that we should fear? What would happen if Australia was part of a Chinese hegemony that was controlled by the Chinese Communist Party? Just asking these questions will generate a whole series of sub-debates and further questions, and that is a good thing. What we don't know is how that debate will play out. It may be that many of us will not like the answer. What we need, what I hope I am achieving just a little, is to start a debate that gives young Australians a reason to stand up for what they believe, just like so many Australian volunteers have done before. Yet, rather than ask them to fight a war totally unprepared, as far too many Australians were asked to do, we need a strategic policy that equips them for the fight, and we need a strategic policy that gives them the best chance to actually avoid war. And it all starts with a debate.